Climate change will be the fight of our lives, making everything else almost irrelevant. To wrap up our session, I'd like to invite Sunny Verghese, co-founder and group CEO of Olam International Limited. He is the current chair of the board for World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the chairman of board of the Human Capital Leadership Institute. Mr. Verghese.
Thank you, Venkatesh. Fellow alums, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real privilege to be here this evening. And I have followed a principle all through my life, not to go to bed without learning one new thing. And today was an abundance of new learning for me. And I was really inspired by J.J. Simon, by Gabriel, and also by Sapanji Popatpaji. Thank you for inspiring us. We live in an information surplus, knowledge surplus, data surplus world. We live in a Google era, but we live in a real insight deficit world. Your talk today, describing what you have achieved in your village, is really full of insights, and I've been really inspired and touched. So thank you for coming here today and sharing your story. Okay, so we are talking about Planet 4.0, legacy planning. What kind of world do we want to leave behind for our next generation and generations to come? And to answer the question, we really need to first take stock of where we are today and what is the desired state of the world that we want to transition to or leave behind. So let's take first stock of where the world is today, and I want to look at this from all the angles of sustainable development. So I want to look at it from the ecological, environmental angle. I want to look at it from the social angle. I also want to look at it from the economic and prosperity angle. And then we can then decide what kind of world we want going forward in the future. So let's start with the ecological angle. And I want to start with planetary boundaries first and foremost, because a group of earth scientists worked for over 60 years to establish what are the critical earth system processes that we need to be within so that we have a safe operating zone to sustain life as we know it. And these earth scientists established 9 critical processes or boundaries, which can be all driven by human-driven impacts and human-driven climate change impacts. The first and the foremost is really climate change itself, which is measured in terms of your greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And the scientists have developed a boundary condition that you cannot exceed 315 parts per million of carbon dioxide concentrations or greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. We are at about 415 parts per million today, and it is rising. And you can see the manifestations and the impact of that across the world in terms of global warming. The world has warmed roughly a degree centigrade from 1950, and it is warming at the rate of 0.017 degrees centigrade a year. And if we follow the current trajectory, we are going to have a huge challenge in restricting global warming to beyond the 2 degrees that we've all agreed to. 195 countries, after 21 years of negotiations, got together in Paris and signed the Paris Accord, which will mean that every country has made nationally intended contributions to reducing the carbon budgets. But in order to do that, we have to dramatically decarbonize the global economy. So we are currently emitting about 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide each year. And if you want to achieve this by 2030, we'll have to bring it down to 20, 25 at the most. And we have to get to 0 by 2050, right? But under the current way we consume and live, carbon emissions are estimated to be at about 58 to 60 gigatons per year by 2030, which would mean that potentially global temperatures can go to what they call a hothouse Earth scenario, which means global temperatures can potentially rise to between 4 and 5 degrees centigrade, which would be catastrophic. You've all seen the extreme weather events that we are confronting on a day-to-day basis. You open up any newspaper or whichever way you consume your news or switch on the TV, it's like taking a walk through the book of Revelations. There is one disaster after the other in every corner of the world happening on a regular basis. In this decade, 2011 to 2019, we've had a little over 500 extreme weather events. Between 1901 and 1910, we had 3 extreme weather events averaged in that decade. So the Cambridge Attribution Science Center has said that the causality of these extreme weather events can be directly related to climate change impacts. So we have already breached the first boundary condition out of the 9. The second boundary condition is really biodiversity. We're having an ecosystem collapse. Roughly 50% of our world wildlife population since the 1970s, according to the World Wildlife Fund, has gone extinct. 50% since 1970, in the last 50 years. So that is quite a significant thing. And the boundary condition that the scientists have come up with is that you cannot have more than 10 species going extinct every year for every million species that we own. Against that boundary condition of 10, we are now having 1,000 species going extinct each year. We are many times that limit. So we have breached the second boundary condition. The third boundary condition is what they call the biogeochemical loading, nitrogen and phosphate loading. Because to produce the food that we all consume, we need to apply nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers. And the boundary condition is that you cannot apply more than 6.2 million tons of phosphatic fertilizers into the soil. Against the 6.2, we are now using 15 million tons a year. We cannot apply more than 65 million tons of nitrogenous fertilizers in the soil. We are today using 170 million tons and growing. China uses about 430 kilograms of fertilizer per hectare. The US uses about 109 kilograms per hectare. Germany, which is the world's largest user of fertilizer apart from China, uses about 138 kilograms, which means as a result and consequence, 77% of all Chinese surface water and lakes are polluted in terms of the biological oxygen demand. So we have breached that boundary condition, and that has significant impacts on climate change, on the microclimates in many parts of the world. The fourth is land use change. In order to produce the food, feed, fiber that we all need to consume, and a growing population estimated to get to 10 billion people by 2050, we are now converting more and more forest land to grow our crops and our food crops. So we're losing about 18.7 million acres of land every year. Equivalent to 27 soccer fields every minute is the deforestation that is happening across the world. We lost 50% of our tropical forests. If you look at the forest risk index, you can see the enormity at which deforestation is happening. How can we reverse it? And if we reverse it, how can we feed a growing population? The scientists have said that we have to preserve 75% of our existing biomes. We have 6, 7 biomes around the world. We are at 62% and it's falling. So that's another boundary that we have breached. Sarpanji talked very eloquently about water budget. Water is the 5th big boundary. We have not yet breached it, but we're hurtling towards breaching it. Each of you in this room would probably be surprised if I told you that you consume about 3,500, 3,600 liters of water a day. If your breakfast this morning was 2 fried eggs sunny side up, it is 130 liters of water. If you had a strip of bacon with it, it's another 180 liters of water. A toast, 15 liters of water. A roasted tomato is about 13, 14 liters of water. Easily your breakfast, if it included a glass of milk or a bowl of cereal, a cup of coffee, you sum it all up, it would have been between 11 and 1,200 liters of water this morning for breakfast. In Singapore, we consume 3,600 calories of food per capita per day. Every calorie that we consume, we need roughly a liter of water. To produce a kg of beef, we need about 17,000, 18,000 liters of water. To produce a kg of pork, we need about 10,000 liters of water. To produce a kg of poultry meat, we need about 6,000 liters of water. This cotton shirt that I'm wearing is 8,000 liters of water. A pair of leather shoes is about 23,000 liters of water. And I'm not throwing out these numbers, right? These are all facts. So water is the other big boundary condition. We have not breached it as yet. The first 4 we have breached, the 5th we are hurtling towards breaching it. And that is why what Sarpanji is doing in his village in terms of water budgeting and getting the maximum drop of water is an inspiring example to follow. Then you have ocean acidification. The pace at which ocean acidification is occurring, the rate at which it is happening, is the highest in 65 million years, destroying marine life as we know it. Right? And then we have the emission of pollutants. which there's no boundary condition established so far, because there are many kinds of pollutants, and it's difficult to have one measure for it. But that's another issue. Aerosol loading, sulfate and nitrate particles in the air, is the 8th boundary condition. We have not breached it, but hurtling towards breaching it. In some parts of the world, in Beijing, in New Delhi, in the winter, you can hardly breathe because of the pollution that is there because of aerosol loading. And finally, it's the ozone layer. And out of the 9 boundary conditions, I've been very pessimistic and worried you all about 8 that we have breached by far, by big magnitudes. But the inspiring story is on the 9th one, the ozone layer. It was a huge issue for us 30 years ago, and the world came together and collectively acted to reverse that trend. The boundary condition is that you should have an ozone layer thickness of 276 Dobson units. We are now at 283 and rising. So if we can change the course on one of these critical boundary conditions, critical processes, I think we can do it on all the other 8 if we can act together to prevent that. So if we want to contemplate what is the kind of world that we want to live for our future generations, we have to take account of the fact that this is our point of departure. This is where we are today. How can we therefore change this? Is the first question. The second part is the social part, because what is inspiring in the Serpanji's example is it's about integrated development. He was not just talking about yield and productivity growth and income growth. You just saw his numbers. The farmers that he's talking about in his village improved incomes 40-fold, from 832 rupees to 33,000 rupees. Right? That is phenomenal. But he didn't focus on just that one piece. Whenever we talk about prosperity and economic development, we focus on GDP and GDP per capita. We don't focus on well-being. What is more important? Your GDPs can grow. Kuwait has one of the world's highest GDPs, but it has very low well-being. There are many countries around the world which have very high GDP per capita, but they have very low well-being. These are not the same thing. It is not that you increase your GDP and GDP per capita, you will have improved well-being. Serpanji's example is all about how do you look at all of these things together? Re-immigration, population management, all of the stuff that he's talking about is about how well-being as a whole, we can go and read this in economics and go and listen to this from university professors, but this is a practical example of how you manage development to really assure well-being. So let's look at well-being, right? So we have 600 million people below the poverty line. What is the poverty line? $1.90 per capita per day. We have 600 million people, which is roughly 8% of the world's population. In 1990, 1.9 billion people, 36% of the world's population were below $1.90, equivalent at that point in time. So we have made huge progress in reducing poverty, but still 600 million people live in extreme poverty, below $1.90. The next poverty definition is $3.20 in the lower income countries, lower middle income countries, and then the higher middle income countries, that poverty line is $5.50. So if you look at that, and if you look at the inequality that is there, almost 80% of the countries in the last 30 years have had the Gini coefficients widening and inequality widening. We have 74 families in the world which own more wealth than the 3.7 billion people combined. Nigeria, where we operate, is one of the poverty capitals of the world. 89 million people in Nigeria today live below $1.90. The second poorest part of the world is the Democratic Republic of Congo, 59 people. India has 55 million people. But the fastest rate of poverty reduction is happening in India. So according to the UN SDGs, goal number 1 is to eliminate poverty. As you speak today, there is a world poverty clock, which I look at every day. Today, 46,000 people escaped the poverty line or went above the poverty line. 15,000 people went below the poverty line today. In order to meet the UN SDG number 1, we need 1.7 people to go above the poverty line or escape from the poverty trap every second. We are now 0.5 every second escaping the poverty trap. If we progress this to 2030, then we will have a deficit of roughly 111 million people still below the poverty line against a goal of eliminating all of it. 3 countries in Asia, including Papua New Guinea, Afghanistan, etc., will still not be able to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. 14 countries in Africa will not be able to do it. Just 3 years ago, in 2016, Africa accounted for 50% of the world's poor. Today, it accounts for 70%, and by 2030, it'll account for 90% of the world's poor. So how do we fix extreme poverty if that's our point of departure and we want to get to a more fair and equitable world? Not only because of the ideal of it, but also because if you do not tackle this problem, in past, when these kinds of inequalities existed, we've always addressed it through violent revolutions. So every country has this challenge, not only the poor countries. Even in the developed world, inequality is rising, whether it's the US, whether it's Singapore, across the world. So how do you address that? So that's from the economic and social side. So what is the world that we want to leave behind? What's a legacy? So your definition of what the ideal world should look like, my definition of what the ideal world should look like, every country's definition of what the ideal world should look like can be very different. So what is the common vision? And the common vision for me is through the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So in 2015, in my view, 2 miracles happened. 194 countries signed the UN SDGs and agreed on 17 goals in terms of the future of the world that we want to see, and 169 sub-goals or targets, and 246 indicators or measures to monitor whether we are achieving those 169 targets across those 17 goals. So those 17 goals and 169 targets, I don't think if you did a survey in this room, any of you would disagree with any of those goals or any of those targets. Obviously, it becomes very difficult to see how you're going to achieve it. So we now know what is our desirability in terms of the vision of the future of the world that we want to leave behind, but whether we can achieve it in terms of the action gap is a question, because the SSDN, the UN organization that monitors the progress of the UN SDGs, has just published its report 3 years after we've agreed to the UN SDGs. So the UN SDGs, we are supposed to achieve this by 2030. We've been given 15 years to achieve this by 2030. We are 3-4 years now into this program. The 3 years milestone, the results of the survey done by SSDN, the UN organization, is that no country out of the 194 countries that have signed up to the UN SDGs are on track to achieve the UN SDGs by 2030. No country, right? So there's a big difference between what we desire and the actions that need to be taken to really make that happen. So what is the vision of this world? The vision of this world is, first, we want to eliminate poverty, extreme poverty. Nobody should live below $1.90 a day, right? Second, we want to eliminate hunger. 819 million people go to bed hungry every day. 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies and vitamin deficiencies. 1.8 billion people are obese or overweight. So how do you tackle this kind of malnutrition and undernutrition? So the second view of the world that we want to become is that we eliminate hunger. Right? The third is quality education, because at the end of the day, if you want to achieve what Sarpanji has achieved in his village, it's all about how do you uplift people through education. The fourth is good health and well-being. Right? So even if you're economically prosperous, but you have all kinds of non-chronic diseases and ailments, then your quality of life and well-being is dramatically impacted. Then it's about gender equality. Then it is about clean water and sanitation. Then it is about clean and affordable energy. And then it is about economic growth and good jobs. And then it is about infrastructure and investments. And then it is about responsible production and consumption. Then it is about climate change. Then it is about life underwater. Then it is about life on land. Then it is about peace, justice, and strong institutions. Look at the countries that are at war in Syria, in Somalia, in Sudan, in Yemen. I mean, generations have lost their lives, right? So the final and last one is partnerships. Because I cannot say that Singapore has its own solar system and is its own island, and it lives in a very different universe. Yeah, we all are part of the same universe, same system. So the tragedy of the commons is if I do something wrong in Singapore, it's going to impact everybody around the world. Or somebody does something wrong in another country, it's going to impact us here as well. So this is the vision of the future that we all want. And nobody can argue with it. And if you look at the 169 targets, and if you look at all the indices and the measures, this is really what we all want to become. But there's no way of getting there if we continue to do the things that we are doing now. Business as usual is not going to get us anywhere on the trajectory of realizing this. So we need to change many things. So what do we need to change? Firstly, we need to change individually. We cannot change the world if you don't want to be the change that we want to see in others. If you believe water is precious, carbon is precious, waste is bad, then what can we do individually in our lives to change that? And the small things that we do, individual commitments. Will you brush with your tap running? Will you shave with your tap running? Could be the starting point of the changes that you want to make in your life. Because if you're not going to change, don't expect anything else to happen. Second, our companies have to change. And our companies have to change in terms of measuring our footprints, in terms of carbon footprint, water footprint, waste footprint. Many of you in this room represent many companies. If I ask you, what is your company's revenues, profits, number of employees, you'll tell me that. But if I ask you, what is your water footprint, what is your waste footprint, what is your carbon footprint, or any other environmental issues, most of us don't have a clue. If you don't measure it, how can you improve? If I change as an individual, but my company does not change, I cannot change the world. And I have to redefine the way I measure value. What was most inspiring in the Serpent story today was about how he has redefined measurement of value, right? Today, only about 15% of a company's value is accounted for by our tangible assets. 85% of our value is explained by intangible assets, our natural capital, our social capital, our human capital, our intangible capital, our intellectual capital, not about our economic capital only. So we have to redefine the way we measure. There are 3 or 4 countries in the world which now have well-being budgets. New Zealand is one of them. New Zealand does not have a very high GDP, but it has the highest score on well-being, followed by Norway, followed by Iceland, and followed by Scotland, not as a country, but as a country within the United Kingdom. You know what is distinguishing about these 4 countries? They're all led by women. Right? So they all understand that well-being is far more important than just a simple GDP growth number or a GDP per capita growth number. So the second thing that has to happen is the companies have to change. The third thing that has to happen is our sectors have to change. The banking sector, the agri and food sector, the energy and gas sector, the pharma sector. We call energy sector big bad oil, big bad pharma. We will all be big bad banks and big bad food and agri companies, profiting from the misery of everybody else. One company changing will not change the world. Our whole sector has to come together. The global food and agri sector, in our case, has to come together to find a pathway of producing more food, feed, and fiber with a fraction of the resources that we use now, with a fraction of the water that we use, a fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions that we incur to produce that food, feed, and fiber. So that is the third thing that has to happen. Our sectors have to change, and we have to encourage that. But we're all hyper-competitive. We hate each other's guts. We won't come together on anything unless the world is really, literally melting down. And the world is literally, really melting down. It's time for us to come together. The fourth thing that has to change is we have to have research and innovation that finds breakthroughs in solving for these grand challenges and these intractable issues, which are all interlinked with interlocked causes. So investment in research and innovation to find solutions. Fifth, the private sector and the voluntary sector, the NGOs and the civil society have to begin to work together. The private sector sees the NGOs as troublemakers. NGOs and civil society see private sector as evil. and we never come together in any kind of collaboration. Unless we create that unusual collaboration, we are not going to be able to change. And then finally, governments and policymakers have to come to the party. If governments and policymakers do not charge for carbon, we are going to pollute indiscriminately. If carbon is free, we will pollute indiscriminately. If today water was free, and the government of Singapore told you that there's no price for water, or no price for electricity, you will consume water and electricity indiscriminately. Today, there's no price for carbon, so you are encouraged or incentivized to pollute indiscriminately. So we need carbon price, and it's great that the Singapore government has introduced a carbon price. And now 47 countries around the world have introduced a carbon price. But it's also about mandatory disclosures. Every company should be asked, just like they present their profit and loss statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flows, to present their footprinting disclosures, carbon footprint, waste footprint, water footprint, and to make commitments that they will improve those footprints over time. And finally, the governments have to change the way they measure progress. It cannot be from the narrow prism and lens of just GDP and GDP per capita, but it has to be a comprehensive lens of how do they make people improve the well-being of their people. When all of these things happen together, we will change the world. So this is about Life Planet 4.0. This theme is about Life 2050, today's conference. And I think all of us have got, from all the interactions, and I'm unfortunate that I attended only the last session, but if the richness of the last session is any indication, I think we can all go to bed saying that we've learned something tonight and been inspired. And that, for me, is a true moment of grace. We didn't deserve it, but we got it. Let's be grateful for that. Thank you.